Dr. Wisdom. It is good to see you again.
Yes, it is, Mr. Sponge. You look well. The last 1,000 years has treated you kindly.
Ah, you are too kind, Dr. Wisdom. Congratulations on your doctoral degree, by the way.
Thanks, Mr. Sponge. You know, a lot has changed since we first discussed the history of educational technology. I thought we could recap what happened from 1900 to the 21st century and focus on instructional media and instructional design. After all, we can now live thousands of years because of that era.
Incredible, isn't it? I'd love to find out more about how we evolved, Dr. Sponge.
To begin, we have to remember film. Film was influential during the visual instructional movement. In fact, from 1900 to 1910, school museums were houses of film slides and photos to aid instruction. From 1914 to 1923, this movement grew, though school museums declined.
If I can remember correctly, sound on film wasn't really practical until the 1920s, right?
Correct. But in the 20s and 30s, the audiovisual instruction movement grew. In 1932, the Department of Visual Instruction was created. In the 1930s, the radio became the next big thing to hit education, but it really had a minimal impact.
Radio. We thought we knew it all, didn't we?
Moving along, in the 1940s, World War II had a great impact on instructional media and design. Films were used for training purposes, with great results. This decade also brought forth instructional design psychology. In the 1950s, television became a new media in education. The FCC and the Ford Foundation invested in educational TV, though that was to decline in the mid-60s.
Wasn't the 50s the time of Bloom's taxonomy?
Very good, Mr. Sponge. Yes, and additionally, audio-visual research and theories of communication began to appear. Psychologists were beginning to work with training systems as well in the 40s and 50s. Remember Sputnik?
How could I forget?
The U.S. reacted to the launch of Sputnik in 1957 by pouring money into science and math education. Because of this, ideas on revision and evaluation of materials were introduced. Michael Scriven introduced the phrases formative and summative evaluation around 1967, and Susan Markle influenced how materials were evaluated around the same time. Another thing that occurred in the 50s was B.F. Skinner's work and his influence on the programmed instructional movement. His ideas on learning objectives have influenced instructional design through the decades.
Fortunately, we don't have the need to learn anymore since all knowledge is programmed within us now.
If you say so, Mr. Sponge. Anyway, criterion reference testing methods were introduced in the 60s and Robert Gain rocked the world with his conditions of learning literature in the 70s.
The decade of John Travolta.
Well, sure. Instructional design models were abundant. Terminology was changed, so instead of audiovisual instruction, educational instruction and instructional technology were used. Also, the Department of Audiovisual Instruction became AECT, or Association for Educational Communications and Technology.
That has disappeared, hasn't it?
Well, as you mentioned, since we live forever and are programmed with all knowledge. Wait a minute. Why am I telling you this?
Well, we have to do something to pass the time, right?
I guess so. In the 70s, instructional improvement centers were developed in academia. They declined in the 80s.
Speaking of 80s, that's the era of microcomputers.
Hold on to your shorts, Mr. Sponge. Yes, microcomputers were important but did not see a dramatic effect until the 90s. But instructional design was very important in the 80s in business, government, and internationally, but not so much in other areas. Also, cognitive psychology began to influence instructional design during this time.
What were some other influences on instructional design?
During the 90s, rapid prototyping, performance support systems, and knowledge management systems were influential, just to name a few.
And the Internet?
Yes, the Internet. Our life source. In the mid-90s, distance learning enrollment doubled and Internet use increased rapidly in educational environments. In 200, the military decided to spend $600 million for distance learning initiatives.
Dollars. We haven't needed those for 5 centuries.
Yes, well, at that time it was a big deal and had an impact on the development of online learning. Speaking of online learning, I wanted to add that Wikipedia was developed in the early 2000s and that was influential for our super robot minds. Also, the XO hardware was developed in the 2010s, which allowed kids all over the earth to have access to laptops. We really wouldn't be here today if that hadn't happened.
1 laptop per child, right? Well, I am going to go find something else to do. Maybe we can go over the mid-2000s next time.
Sure, Mr. Sponge, maybe we'll do that.